Welcome to Thoughtful Planning, the place where real conversation, expert insight, and a touch of humor meet to turn our end-of-life uncertainties into self-assurance. I'm your co-host, Santiago, a history buff and a big kid at heart.
And I'm Honey, your guide through the intricate dance of planning with care and a whole lot of warmth. Every week, we're here to turn those intimidating "are we ready" moments into confident "everything is under control" moments. Today's journey is one you won't want to miss. Hi, welcome to Thoughtful Planning. I'm Honey.
And I'm Santiago.
Today we have a special guest from a local family-owned and operated funeral business here in Boerne, Texas. This business has been around since 1882, which is over 140 years.
Wow, that's a long time. It seems like here lately, we've been attending too many funerals. A lot of them have been at what we call the old traditional type of funeral home. They're not always the most welcoming places to go. They kind of old and musty and somewhere you don't want to be. But earlier this year, we went to this local funeral home, which was freaking awesome. We met our guest. He gave us a tour, and it was one of the most inviting places that I think I've ever been. It's not your typical funeral home that you're used to seeing. It's actually a place that, well, it kind of felt like home. Mm-hmm. So with that, I want to pose to you this essential question. Why is it important for you to plan your own funeral?
That's a great question. And lucky for us, we have an expert to help us with this question today. We'd like to welcome the owner of Ebensberger-Fisher Funeral Home, Dustin Fisher. Thank you for joining us, Dusty. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Dustin Fisher. I own Ebensberger-Fisher Funeral Home with my wife, JoLynn Fisher. We are at 1265 North Main in Boerne, Texas, 78006. You can reach us at 830-249-2321. And our email is info@boernefuneralhome.com.
Okay. So, Dusty, would you give us an idea of the percentage of people that actually come to you with a plan and they know what their loved ones really want in a funeral?
You know, that's hard to put a number on. One of the things that is extremely important is to have a conversation with loved ones. I don't know if I can put a number on that, but it makes it extremely difficult if you come in, because we're not looking at a small purchase. A funeral is one of the largest purchases that you can do in your lifetime. And if you don't have a clue of what they wanted, it makes it very, very difficult to try to navigate through that. I would say that roughly 10 to 15% of the people know exactly what they want. But if they know whether or not the family wants to do cremation versus burial, you can take half of those decision-making issues off the table. And then that gives us a way to know, do we want to go left or do we want to go right? Well, if we're going to go right, then that brings in this whole scenario. If we want to go, it kind of limits some of the decision making that is required. Not that you can't do the same thing, cremation versus burial. You can absolutely do that. There's just, the difference would be not going to a cemetery and you could conclude everything, and then the cremation could be done at a later time. So to answer your question, I don't know that there is, I can't really put a finger on the percentage of people that know exactly what they want, but I think it's very, very important to have that conversation sooner rather than later. At the time, it can create a lot of angst and anxiety that's not where you need to be spending your mental capacity at the time. I think you need to focus on some other things.
Yeah.
Okay.
So with that,
what type of burials do you offer? I heard cremation, and then the traditional kind, which is
a casket and putting you in the ground.
We're talking about the difference between a full traditional funeral, the one that is most people my age and older, they kind of grew up with, which is you would do a visitation the evening before. Some people call it a wake. We generally call it a visitation. The following day would be a funeral service with the casket present, whether that's at the funeral home or whether that is at a church. After that service is concluded, we would go to the vehicles and go in procession to a cemetery where the cemetery or the graveside service, I guess, the committal service would be rendered. And then after that, everyone would be dismissed. So that would be considered a full traditional. Now, with cremation on the rise, you can still do it exactly the same. The only difference would be instead of going to the cemetery, things would be concluded, whether that's at the funeral home or at the church. And then we would come back to the funeral home to where the cremation would take place, whether it's that day or a day or so from that. But everything would be concluded rather than going in procession to the cemetery. So those are the two traditional type ways to do it. A popular way of doing this now is if cremation is kind of brought into the mix and they don't want to utilize a casket and they don't want a public viewing, then it is not necessary to do the embalming. It's not necessary to have a casket. We can take care of everything. There just won't be a casket and a viewing prior to the cremation. Some people opt for the cremation to take place prior to anything, and then an urn can be utilized, whether that's at the funeral home or the church or wherever that may be. Once the cremation has been taken care of, families are not necessarily beholden to a funeral home to bridge that gap and conduct a funeral. Does that make sense? Like if there is a church, and we have quite a few churches around, and they have staff that they can handle the memorial services. And so if a family is looking at ways that they can mitigate some of the costs, that could possibly be one. I've instructed all of my staff, we are not here to take your money. We're going to try and do our best to make it as memorable as we can, but not necessarily reach out and have you pay for things that you may or may not need.
Mm-hmm. I never thought about that. But one thing that I do like about your establishment is the fact that it's so open and it's inviting that, I think even if I were cremated, I'd still want to use your facility just so people feel at home and not traditional, stuffed in a church somewhere. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying, I think that your little gathering place, the kitchen and all that other stuff that you have, all the facilities that you have, it's so inviting and it would make it more of a, what did Robin call it? A funeral?
Yes.
You make it's something, a celebration instead of a memorial.
Right. Right.
A lot of people are using that terminology. It's a celebration of life. With our new facility, we've kind of seen a little bit of a difference in the way that people want to do things. They would prefer to do it here at the funeral home. And then they can, if they opt to, they can have caterers come in. They can have a reception with food and things of that nature. And then that kind of takes the place of visitation the evening before. So everything kind of moves and you just have to be fluid and go along with it as long as the family is comfortable with what they've selected. Mm-hmm. But there's an ebb and flow. And so the traditional funeral is not as traditional anymore, I guess. Everything is kind of moving a little bit. So if there's a way that we can kind of meet that need, that's what we're trying to do. We've had a multitude of different caterers that come in. The family can kind of take care of that with those caterers. We will have chairs and tables set for that. And so people, they like the fact that they don't feel rushed after the service. Everybody can take a deep breath. They can get over the hard part, and then they can celebrate a little bit. The live videos are still played on all the monitors throughout the funeral home. People can kind of spread out. They can talk. They can share a meal and things like that. And that's been a popular thing for people. Some people opt to go to a restaurant, which is great. But here, you're not expecting people to have to travel to go somewhere else. Everybody can kind of take a deep breath and just kind of relax and see people family members a lot that they haven't seen in years, and finally have a chance to kind of visit. And it's kind of taken some of the visitation things off the table a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. So
wait, I have some more questions about that. Do you offer any green type of funeral arrangements at your facility?
We do. It depends on what that entails. Now, we can do, when you say green, that can go several different ways. There are certain cemeteries that are deemed as green burial cemeteries. The ones that we deal with, and 99% of the cemeteries that we deal with here, that doesn't necessarily mean all over the state, they're going to require an outside container, which is something that the casket would fit in. It's called an outer burial container. The minimum would be a concrete liner. And so all that being said, it kind of takes away some of the quote unquote green out of it, because a lot of people, when they say green, they want to return their earthly remains to the earth as quick as possible.
Yeah.
And so some of the outer container can be a little bit detrimental in that they're mainly designed to support the earth's load. Some have a protective quality, some don't, but it's still going to support the earth's load. So that kind of takes away a little bit of the speed in what the green burial is trying to do. But there are some cemeteries that they kind of cater to that. And if that's something that they're adamant about, we can absolutely track all that down.
Cool. Wait, and I have another question. When you mentioned that people come there and they can have it catered, then are they allowed to have an alcoholic beverage?
Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am. If they decide that they want alcohol to be served, what we like to do is we will bring in a bartender. And then it would require us to do an off-duty officer. But they would we're not really set up with TABC as of yet. And so the family would contract that out, but we would make it to where, and all that's kind of in flux, but we would need to make it to where there's an off-duty officer just to make everything legitimate, and there's that we're not trying to slide around anything. Everything is above table.
Yeah.
Would you gave the abbreviation TE, I think it was AC. Can you tell me?
TABC?
TABC.
That's the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, they're the ones that they dictate. They do licensing and things like that for the restaurants. And
okay.
I don't necessarily want to do that, but we would need a bartender that is licensed through TABC, where they can, that's what they're licensed for, is to monitor that. And then we have an off-duty officer that will make sure that everything is seamless.
Okay.
And it's not a deal at a funeral or at a visitation where the alcohol, it's not one of those things where it's a big party. It's just people might have a drink or two just to take the edge off and socialize a little bit. I don't think we're looking at a situation where people are going to be swinging from the chandeliers in this case. I think everybody would be very reverent to the reason that they're there. But it just kind of covers Yes. Well, as long as we have the off-duty police officer, you knock yourself out. So.
I'm the driver.
So with that said, what's the most outrageous or memorable funeral experience that you've had in your years doing this?
Most of those would probably go to more on the cremation side of it, because there's not a rule book, so to speak. We have a deal where we go down to the coast and we'll scatter cremains, and we generally will do that in the Rockport area. But we've had people that requested loading shotgun shells and have a big keg party, and they shoot the shotgun shells up in the air, and so there's not a right or a wrong to any of that at all. It's your imagination is what would limit you, and if you have a limitless imagination, then who's to say what's right or wrong?
Sounds like another challenge.
I don't know about that one. I'll have to work.
What is the planning process like at your facility for, like, if we were to come in there?
For pre-planning or an at-need type situation? Explain your question.
For planning a funeral.
So we're starting off with, what should we expect?
Okay. So if it is what in the industry would be considered an at-need situation, that means that you are coming in to make arrangements for a family member that has passed away. Once the death has occurred, then we would, wherever that may be, would contact the funeral home, whether that's on hospice or a hospital. They would contact the funeral home, and that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We would make arrangements to come pick up your loved one. We would come back to the funeral home. During that time, we would be setting up a time of when we could sit down with you. A lot of times, depending on when that may be, families tend to like a little bit of a time to catch their breath. If it's late in the evening, we recommend that they try to get a little bit of rest before they come in, because it is an extremely emotional time. And I don't want you making financial decisions with all of these emotions going on. It's better to take a step back and figure out whether or not is it what mom deserves, or, is it what would mom want us to do this, or we want nothing but the best for mom with a champagne taste on a beer budget, right? And so people need to understand that bills come due regardless of whether that person may still be with you or not. And so we don't want to do things that would make you, I guess, spend extravagantly when we can do the same thing at a little bit lower cost and still get the same thing, but you're still able to take care of some of those things that are lingering that will have to be addressed at some point. And I don't want you making those decisions when you're exhausted and when you're emotionally drained. So we would have you come in at the appropriate time. We would have you give us a lot of the information that's going to go on the death certificate. A lot of the things that kind of can trip people up are getting their hands on social security numbers, on the person that passed away's mother's name, including her maiden. That one can trip some people up. Father's full name. Date of birth is generally not an issue, but those others can kind of trip people up. And then the longer we have to wait for those actual answers that are honest and we know exactly what we're dealing with, that's what we need. Most of the other information is readily available as far as address and things of that nature. But those are the three that can kind of trip people up. If there's A lot of families will ask to have that information prior to, so they can kind of put their mind on it and have that written down when they come in. That can reduce a lot of time that you're having to sit across from me in an uncomfortable situation trying to figure out how we're going to get from point A to point B. We would select whether or not cremation is a viable option or burial. And that goes back to that conversation that we had prior to. If you know those answers, it significantly eases your mind in which way we're going to go. So now that we know which direction we're going to go, then we go through a checklist and we find out who would do the service, where we would want to do the service, register book, casket selection, if that comes into play. So that's when all of the other questions get done. All of my directors, they give out their cell phone to their families that they're dealing with. They can reach them 24 hours a day. The last thing I want a family to do is to sit there and worry about something at night. Just call us. 9 times out of 10, we can answer the question right there.
I'm sure that's appreciated.
Kind of get on with relaxing a little bit and kind of go from there.
So, like what Honey and I, we plan to do is actually pre-plan our funeral. So there's very little that either one of us would have to do, or God forbid, both of us go at the same time that our children would have to do. Can you explain that process to our listeners? What would that entail?
I have never had a family that was upset because their parents or their spouse has come in and prearranged everything. That does not necessarily mean that monies have to change hands in a prearrangement policy. You can at least have all of your wishes down. We can put that in a file with all of our pre-needs. We open it up and 99.9 of the checklist things are done. And so we have people that they've selected cremation. They've signed off on their own cremation authorization paperwork. And so there's not a question as to what their wishes were when the family comes in. On the other side of that coin, you can do an insurance policy. We're basically underwriters for pre-need companies. And what we can do is we go in, and once we go ahead and go through that process and we start an insurance policy, the biggest benefit of doing that, if you're going to, is that it locks in the cost. So the only cost that we wouldn't be able to lock in would be things that we can't control, like cash advances, which would be like obituaries or the cost of death certificates or things like that. But the actual hard costs of the funeral home and what we charge would be locked in. They won't ever go up. And so if there's disposable income around, it would be a very wise move to get that done. A lot of people don't realize that they can be transferable. So just because you bought this policy at my funeral home doesn't mean that that can't be transferred to another funeral home or you to ever relocate. That's a non-issue as far as we're concerned. It happens all the time in the industry. We're family owned. A lot of times the family owned funeral homes tend to work a little bit easier than some of the corporate owned. Not that the corporations won't, but there's that gets into the whole business aspect of it. The family wouldn't necessarily see any changes. It would be kind of dependent upon the other funeral home whether or not to accept it. But yes, they are transferable. It's an absolute benefit for families to do that.
What is the current cost of a funeral, since you brought up that?
So if you came in today without cemetery property and we were going to do a full traditional funeral, we're probably, and the cost of the casket would be somewhat of a limiting factor on this, but you're probably anywhere in the neighborhood of $10,000 to $12,000 plus the cemetery property to do a full traditional cremation, you're probably half of that would be my guess. If you were to do a cremation and then a memorial service after, that's probably even less than that. So there's some stair steps. So there's a little bit of room in there depending on how you want it to go and kind of what you're looking at budget wise. And so the funeral home, whichever funeral home you would select, they need to be cognizant of that fact and give you every option possible so that you understand what is available, what you're wanting to do, and then let's find the best way to get you there at the most economical point, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. What, in terms of a payment plan, you mentioned if, like, we could go talk to you about getting us set up and then you would create a payment plan.
With insurance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's an insurance plan.
So the insurance, this is another way that you kind of you need to watch your nickels, because if there's insurance policies and then in those, they have them structured several different ways. There's one that is, if you go with a fully funded thing and you're making these payments, if something were to happen to you within, like, I want to say 3 to 6 months, then they would pay a certain portion. If it goes like from say 6 months to a year, they would pay a larger portion. But then if it's after, like, I want to say 2 years, I'm not 100% sure on that, then it would be fully funded. But this is the thing on those, is you need to look at what the cost to have that fully insured thing would be, because it's an insurance policy. They're going to tack on, I don't know their term offhand, but they're going to tack on a little bit just to insure it like that. Now, another option of doing that is you can do what I've always called dollar for dollar. And there's not a premium necessarily attached to that. It's just whatever monies have been paid in to that policy is what it's worth at the time. It still locks in your cost, but whatever money has been paid in is what you got. And if you run it on say a 5-year payment plan, and at the end of 5 years, it's paid for, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I think that's the way I'd want to go. It's just to pay it off, get it ready, and just basically walk in and say, he's here, kind of deal.
Right. If some people they have insurance policies that would take care of it, that's one way to go. But the pre-need policy, the benefit is that it does lock in the cost. So that is, in my mind, that is the number one reason to do that. Because I can assure you, in this whole industry, the costs are not going to go down.
Yeah.
Every one of our vendors, they go up the same month every year, and they have yet to go down. So it's just one of those deals.
So you talked a little bit about your plot, your spot, your final parking spot in the cemetery, because I know it's different. It's different for us because I'm a veteran, and I've got a spot that I've got to secure at Fort Sam. That's where I want to end up. But if you're not, how do you go about that? Getting a plot or a spot to be buried?
If it's going to be in the Boerne cemetery, then I'm a sexton of that cemetery, so I have the ability to sell those lots, as does my competitor, Holt & Holt. They can both do the same. We can both do the same thing. We just run it through the city. If it is going to be an outside cemetery, then there's going to be a contact somewhere. And so we can kind of help facilitate that. Cost comes into play on these other cemeteries. Some cemeteries have an actual cemetery office per se. And so they can do the actual selling of the lot at their office. But if it's Boerne proper, then we can help do that through our office.
Okay. All right.
Fort Sam, like you had mentioned, Fort Sam is that's a horse of another color. We would just utilize your DD 214, that's an important thing on anything as far as military is concerned. Always find your DD 214, safeguard that. Santiago, in your case, I would want your DD 214. I would put it in your pre-need file, whether or not that's a policy or not. If we have a file, have that DD 214, and then we would contact the National Scheduling Office, and I think they're in St. Louis, and they schedule for every national cemetery in the nation. Once we get that set, then we would take care of as far as Fort Sam or whichever national cemetery.
Mm-hmm. So I know that right now you said costs are going up on a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of businesses that unfortunately aren't making it. So with this prepaid funeral or the insurance policy, however we go, should people be scared that their investment that they're making could be lost due to a business closure of some sort?
So these policies, they're governed. It's an actual insurance policy. Some funeral homes do trusts. We don't do that here. We are basically underwriters for some companies. That is governed by the Texas Department of Banking and the Texas Department of Insurance. So it is an actual insurance policy that will be honored, whether it's if a funeral home does go out of business, that is still a viable policy, and it can be taken up by other funeral homes. And so
okay,
it has happened before, but you as a consumer should feel protected in that because it is governed by the state.
Well, that eliminates a fear for me that I had.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it's a valid fear. It just is. A lot of these questions they have a semblance of going to a car dealer and you don't know the ins and outs of buying a car. And so you're just trusting somebody to guide you in the right direction. And so it can be scary. So that is an absolutely valid fear. So you just need to have a good relationship with whichever funeral home you're working with and your director. And if you don't feel comfortable, then you need to turn around and find somebody that does make you comfortable.
Yeah, being comfortable is a big deal for us.
Yes. So is there anything that we have not asked you that you think is very important for the listeners to know that you'd like to share?
If I could just tell everybody, have a conversation, just a conversation, and have some idea of what people want. Because if you don't have that conversation, then I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions, and you're going to say, I don't know. And when you say, I don't know, I can't help you. I can't help you work through that. So have a conversation. Mm-hmm. If you have some semblance of an idea, I don't want you to beat yourself up because you don't know whether they wanted to be buried or you don't know if they wanted to be cremated. And it happens a lot. And so we have to navigate those waters, and it can be a slippery slope, especially in the mindset that you're in. So have a conversation, go to your funeral home of choice and just get paperwork and fill it out, do it at home, and then have them put it on file. So it's 99% of your questions are answered and you don't have to worry about that. And then you can worry about the grieving part because you need to be able to distinguish. There is going to be a time where you got to put your business hat on in this whole thing. So you might have to take your grieving hat off for a minute and put on your business hat, but we want you to take that off as soon as you can, put on your grieving hat, and get you where you need to be sooner rather than later.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I mean, for me, you've made us feel really comfortable. And when we met in person, and then even more so now, and we appreciate you taking your time to talk with us about
100%.
all this.
I'm glad that y'all are doing this because it's a very important aspect. And we're sure not everybody's getting out of this thing. So there's going to be a time when you will have to sit across the desk. And so the more informed you can be to do that, it's going to make it easier. I promise you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you again, Dusty, for being our guest today. Would you like to share with our listeners how they can connect with you?
Sure. You can email us at info@boernefuneralhome.com. Our phone number is 830-249-2321. The name of the funeral home is Ebensberger-Fisher Funeral Home. We're here in Boerne, 1265 North Main Street in Boerne, Texas, 78006. We answer the phone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you have questions, give us a shout.
Yeah, and I'm not kidding you folks. If you go to visit Dusty's facility, it's beautiful. And it's, I've already made up my mind. It's where I'd like my final services to be, just because it's so open and inviting. With that, let's circle back and reflect a little bit on that essential question that we started with. Why is it important for you to plan your own funeral?
Well, until next time, remember every chapter you write today shapes your legacy tomorrow. Thank you for joining us at Thoughtful Planning. And just like the vibrant hues of a setting sun, we're wrapping up another episode of Thoughtful Planning. Every shared story and insight is a step closer to turning uncertainty into celebrations of preparedness.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, remember that every surprise that comes our way is an opportunity to grow, adapt, and learn. Stay tuned for more stories, expert insight, and of course, a touch of wit in our next episode.
We're not just co-hosts, we're fellow travelers on this journey. For more information on additional resources, which will help you take the next step in planning, look for the link in the show notes for our membership. Join us next time for another episode of Thoughtful Planning. Until then, keep living, laughing, and loving every moment.